In an era when homosexuality was a crime, Evan Morgan turned his castle into a sanctuary for drag queens, princes, and forbidden lovers. He was the bisexual warlock who partied with royalty and defied an empire. This is the scandalous queer history of Wales's most dangerous aristocrat. But before he was a monster, he was a millionaire. Evan Morgan was born in 1893, not into the gentle life of farming gentry, but into the grime of industrial royalty. The Morgan fortune was built on coal, black gold, that flowed from the dangerous tunnels of South Wales directly into the silk-lined pockets of Tredegar House. His father, Courtenay, was the archetype of the Edwardian aristocrat, a man of the gun and the hunt who expected a sturdy soldier for an heir. Instead, he got a changeling. Evan was physically delicate, artistic, and unsettlingly beautiful. While his father stalked the moors, Evan haunted the library, separated from the world by a pane of glass, filling the empty corridors with ghosts of his own making. Then came the event that shattered the world, the First World War. While history views it as a conflict, for Evan's generation, it was the apocalypse. The stable, ordered world of the Victorians, where everyone knew their place and God was in his heaven, was fed into a meat grinder. Evan, despite his fragile health, served in the Welsh Guards. He didn't see the worst of the front lines in the same way the infantry did, but he saw enough. He saw the grim reality of the 20th century. He saw that the old rules, honor, duty, the divine right of kings, stopped no bullets. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world had changed. The young men who returned were not the same young men who had marched away. They carried a profound nihilism in their bones. If life could be snuffed out so cheaply, if the grand edifices of civilization could crumble so easily, then what was the point of restraint? What was the point of following the rules of a society that had just committed suicide? This was the birth of the Roaring Twenties, and Evan Morgan was perfectly positioned to become its dark prince. He was young, he was titled, he was fabulously wealthy, and he was completely disillusioned. He threw himself into the social whirlwind of London with the energy of a fanatic. He became a fixture of what the press called the bright young things. This was a group of young aristocrats and bohemians who scandalized British society with their behavior. They were the original celebrity culture. They organized elaborate scavenger hunts through midnight London. They threw parties where guests dressed as babies or circus performers. They drank cocktails until dawn, and they lived as if there were no tomorrow because for many of their friends, there hadn't been. But even among the bright young things, Evan stood out. Most of them were just looking for a good time, trying to numb the trauma of the war with jazz and gin. Evan was looking for something else. He was looking for power. Not political power. He found the House of Lords boring. He was looking for spiritual power. He wanted to hack reality itself. This is where the duality of Evan Morgan begins to sharpen. On one hand, he was the ultimate socialite. He knew everyone. He was friends with Augustus John, the wild bohemian painter. He knew Aldous Huxley and H.G. Wells. He was intimately connected to the royal family, particularly Prince George, the Duke of Kent, who was known for his own wild streak in drug use. Evan moved through these circles with the grace of a panther, always the best-dressed man in the room, always armed with a biting wit. But beneath the tuxedo and the champagne, there was a hunger that the parties couldn't satisfy. Evan had always been drawn to the mystical. As a young man, he had made a decision that shocked his staunchly Protestant family and the conservative Welsh society they ruled over. He converted to Catholicism, Now, in modern times, changing religion might seem like a personal detail. In the 1920s, for a Welsh lord whose ancestors had fought for the Protestant cause, it was a scandal. But for Evan, Catholicism wasn't just about theology. It was about the aesthetic. He loved the ritual. He loved the smell of frankincense, the heavy embroidered robes, the Latin chants, the sense of ancient secret knowledge passed down through centuries. He loved the drama of the Mass. It appealed to his theatrical nature. He took it seriously enough to spend significant time at the Vatican. He charmed the hierarchy of the Church just as easily as he charmed the hostesses of London. He became a papal chamberlain, a privy chamberlain of the sword and cape. Picture him in Rome, dressed in the crisp, medieval-style uniform of the Vatican court, complete with a sword, attending to the Pope himself. He was the picture of a devout, high-ranking Catholic nobleman. Hold that image in your mind, the pious servant of Rome. Because when he returned to London, or to the seclusion of Tredegar House, the Catholic vestments came off and different kinds of robes went on. Evan didn't see a contradiction between serving the Pope and dabbling in the occult. To him, they were just two different frequencies of the same power. He was what we might call a syncretist in the extreme. He believed you could take the best bits of Catholicism, mix them with Egyptian mythology, throw in some Kabbalah, and create your own path to enlightenment. He treated religion like a buffet. This spiritual restlessness led him into the arms of the occult underground. London and Paris in the 1920s were teeming with secret societies, mystics, and charlatans. It was a time of spiritualism, of seances, of people desperately trying to contact the dead sons and husbands they had lost in the trenches. But Evan wasn't interested in the parlor tricks of contacting Aunt Mabel. He was interested in high magic. High magic, or ceremonial magic, is a very different beast from fortune-telling. It is an intellectual, rigorous, and often dangerous pursuit. It involves the study of complex symbol systems, the memorization of long rituals, and the attempt to alter one's own consciousness to commune with higher or lower intelligences. It requires discipline and a certain kind of arrogance. You have to believe that you, a human being, have the right to command the forces of the universe. Evan had that arrogance in spades. He began to collect a library of grimoires, books of magical instruction. He started buying rare artifacts, ritual swords, chalices, and strange antiques that carried energy. And inevitably, in this small, dark world of seekers and sorcerers, his path crossed with the man who would define his reputation forever. They met in Paris, the city of light and shadow. Aleister Crowley was already a legend. By the time he met Evan, he was older, broke, and notorious. He had been expelled from Italy by Mussolini for the alleged depravities occurring at his Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù. The British press painted him as a monster, a man who devoured babies and worshipped Satan. The reality was more complex. Crowley was a brilliant poet, a master mountaineer, a chess expert, and a man who had dedicated every waking second of his life to destroying the sexual and religious mores of the Victorian age. His motto was, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." For a young man like Evan Morgan, who felt suffocated by the expectations of his class and the judgment of his father, Crowley must have seemed like a prophet of freedom. Crowley preached that every man and woman is a star with their own unique orbit, and that the only sin is to restrict your true nature. For Crowley, Evan Morgan was the perfect catch. Crowley was always looking for two things, magical talent and money. Evan had both. He was fabulously wealthy, which meant he could fund Crowley's publishing ventures and his expensive lifestyle. But more than that, Crowley saw something in Evan that he rarely saw in his other wealthy sycophants. He saw a genuine aptitude for the dark arts. Crowley described Evan as having a natural genius for magic. This wasn't just flattery to get alone. Crowley wrote in his private diaries about Evan's ability to enter trance states, his intuitive understanding of symbolism, and his fearlessness in the face of the uncanny. When Crowley called him the adept of adepts, he was acknowledging Evan as an equal, perhaps even a superior, in terms of raw potential. Their relationship was intense, volatile, and deeply weird. They traveled together, they performed rituals together, and according to many biographers, they were almost certainly lovers. In the fluid sexual landscape of Evan's life, Crowley was a mentor who encouraged him to break every taboo. But it was when Evan brought this new obsession back to Tredegar House that the real transformation began. By 1929, Evan was still the heir, not yet the Viscount, but he had free reign of the house when his father was away. He began to reshape the environment to suit his new identity. He is no longer just Mr. Morgan. He is a magus. The servants at Tredegar House were the first to notice the change. Servants in a great house are the invisible witnesses to history. They see everything. They began to whisper about the strange smells drifting up from the cellar, not the smell of coal or damp, but the heavy, cloying scent of exotic incense that lingered on Evan's clothes. They whispered about the strange deliveries arriving from London, crates marked fragile, containing statues of animal-headed gods, bundles of dried herbs, and boxes of candles made from black wax. Evan began to designate specific areas of the house for his practices. The most infamous of these was the magic room. There is some debate among historians about exactly where this room was located. Some say it was deep in the bowels of the house, a soundproof chamber where his chanting wouldn't disturb the rest of the household. Others claim it was one of the upper bedrooms, the windows draped in heavy black velvet to block out the Welsh sun, creating a space of perpetual night. In this room, Evan constructed an altar. This wasn't a Christian altar. It was set up according to the strict geometries of ceremonial magic. It would have held the 4 elemental weapons: the wand for fire, the cup for water, the dagger for air, and the pentacle for earth. It would have been inscribed with the names of angels and demons in Hebrew and Enochian, the angelic language discovered by the Elizabethan magician John Dee. Evan wasn't playing dress-up. He was performing evocations. This is the attempt to summon a spirit to visible appearance. It is a grueling psychological process. It involves fasting, sleep deprivation, and hours of rhythmic chanting until the magician's mind cracks open and he sees something. We have accounts that suggest Evan believed he had a familiar spirit, a guide from the other side that would advise him. He claimed this spirit was of ancient Egyptian origin. He would enter a trance, his body rigid, his voice changing, and allow this entity to speak through him. Contrast this image with the public face of Evan Morgan. By day, he might be opening a flower show in Newport, smiling benevolently at the locals, shaking hands with the mayor, looking every inch the responsible aristocrat. He would discuss the coal prices, the maintenance of the estate cottages, the local politics. Then, as night fell and the shadows lengthened across the parkland, he would retreat to his sanctuary, don his robes, perhaps the ones embroidered with the silver serpent, and step into a world of demons and deities. This duality was the core of his existence. He was living in 2 worlds simultaneously: the rigid, class-bound world of British society and the fluid, chaotic, terrifying world of the occult. And he delighted in the tension between them. He loved the secret. He loved knowing that the people bowing to him in the street had no idea that the man they were honoring had spent the previous night cursing an enemy or invoking the spirit of Mars. But a secret like that is hard to keep. It exerts a pressure. It demands to be let out. And Evan found a way to let it out, not through public confession, but through the theater of his social life. He began to turn Tredegar House into a stage where he could act out his fantasies and where he could force his guests to participate in his strange reality. He started with the animals. If you were a guest arriving at Tredegar House in the early 1930s, the first thing you had to navigate wasn't the etiquette of which fork to use. It was the wildlife. Evan decided that a magician needed familiars, and a boring old dog simply wouldn't do. He wanted animals that reflected his own untamed, exotic nature. He turned the grounds and the house itself into a private zoo that would have given a health and safety inspector a heart attack. He kept bears in an enclosure on the grounds, actual bears. But the real terror was inside the house. His favorite companion was a macaw named Blue Boy. Now, a parrot sounds charming, pirate-esque. Blue Boy was not charming. Blue Boy was a menace. He was infamous for his foul temper and his vocabulary of obscenities, likely taught to him by Evan himself. Blue Boy would sit on Evan's shoulder during formal dinners, shrieking bad words and occasionally swooping down to steal food off the guests' plates, or, if he was in a bad mood, nip at their ears. Evan found this hilarious. It was a power move. He was forcing his high society guests to endure this chaos, to smile politely while a bird screamed at them, because to complain would be bad manners. Then there was the kangaroo. It sounds like a joke, but it is a documented fact. Evan owned a kangaroo. He also owned a pair of boxing gloves. He would put the gloves on the kangaroo and spar with it in the gilded room beneath priceless 17th century ceiling paintings. Imagine the absurdity of the scene. A viscount of the realm, sweating and laughing, trading punches with a marsupial in a Baroque drawing room, while his butler stood by, holding a towel. But the most notorious inhabitant, and the one that features most heavily in the dark legends of the house, was Honey Bear. Honey Bear was a baboon. Baboons are not pets. They are large, aggressive, highly intelligent primates with canine teeth longer than a lion's. They are strong enough to rip a man's arm out of its socket. Evan allowed Honey Bear free rein of the house. The baboon would lope down the corridors, terrorizing the maids. It was known to attack guests without warning. There are stories of people having to lock themselves in bathrooms, while Honey Bear hammered on the door, screeching, trying to turn the handle. The baboon represented the primal chaotic forces he was trying to harness in his magical workings. It was untamable, just like he believed himself to be. It was also a fantastic tool for intimidation. If you could sit in a chair with a baboon on your lap, stroking its fur while it bared its teeth at a visiting bishop, you were clearly a man of power. You were a master of beasts. This menagerie was the first warning sign that the balance in Evan's mind was shifting. The occult wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was bleeding into his daily life. The boundaries were dissolving. The house was becoming a physical manifestation of his psyche, beautiful, wealthy, but filled with unpredictable dangers and wild beasts. And as the 1920s bled into the 1930s, and Evan officially inherited the title upon his father's death in 1934, the restraints came off completely. The eccentric heir became the mad viscount. The stage was set for the era of the great parties, the weekend gatherings that would cement his reputation as a monster and a legend. The house was about to wake up. By 1934, the transition was complete. Courtenay Morgan had passed away, leaving the title, the fortune, and the keys to Tredegar House in the hands of his son. The older generation, the men with stiff collars and stiffer morals who had governed the estate with an iron grip, are gone. The Victorian era has finally been buried in the family crypt, and Evan Morgan is standing on the grave dancing. If the 1920s had been a time of experimentation for Evan, the 1930s became a time of absolute, unchecked manifestation. He was now the second Viscount Tredegar. In the feudal hierarchy of South Wales, he was practically a king. There was no one left to tell him no. There was no father to hide the incense burners from, no mother to scold him for the strange guests arriving at midnight. The house was his, and he intended to turn it into a world that operated entirely on his own frequency. The transformation of Tredegar House from a stately home into a fortress of hedonism was not subtle, it was an explosion. The locals in Newport, the miners and the dock workers who lived in the terraced houses that huddled in the valley below, began to notice the change. They saw the convoys of luxury cars, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, Lagondas, roaring up the long driveway on Friday evenings. They saw the lights of the great house burning until dawn, casting long, strange shadows across the deer park. They heard the rumors, passed in hushed tones over pints of ale in the local pubs, about what exactly was happening behind those heavy oak doors. They called them the weekend parties, a benign phrase that utterly failed to capture the reality of the saturnalia that took place within. To receive an invitation to Tredegar House in the mid-1930s was to be handed a golden ticket to the most exclusive, dangerous, and exhilarating show on earth. It was a mark of status, but it was also a test of character. Not everyone survived a weekend with Evan Morgan intact. The guest list was a masterpiece of social engineering. Evan curated his parties like a chemist mixing volatile compounds, waiting to see if they would explode. He despised the boring uniformity of the traditional aristocracy. He didn't want a room full of people who all went to the same schools, married the same cousins, and talked about the same fox hunts. He wanted friction. He wanted the sparks that fly when worlds collide. On any given Saturday night in the Great Hall, beneath the gaze of the solemn oil portraits of his ancestors, you might find a surreal tableau. In one corner, H.G. Wells, the socialist visionary and father of science fiction, might be arguing about the future of humanity with a high Tory politician who believed the British Empire was ordained by God. In another, the bohemian painter Augustus John, wild-haired and usually drunk, might be sketching a portrait of a young, terrified debutante on a napkin. But it wasn't just the famous and the powerful. Evan had a predilection for the rough trade, the handsome sailors from the Newport docks, the boxers, the rugged young men who had no business being in a viscount's drawing room other than their physical beauty and their willingness to participate in Evan's games. He mixed them in with the royalty and the writers, erasing the class lines that defined British society with a stroke of his hand. At Tredegar House, a docker could drink champagne with a duchess, provided he was interesting enough or beautiful enough to catch Evan's eye. Dominating this chaotic menagerie was the presence of royalty. It is a historical fact, though one often whispered rather than shouted, that Prince George, the Duke of Kent, was a frequent visitor. George was the fourth son of King George V and the brother of the future kings, Edward VIII and George VI. He was the wild royal, a man whose appetites mirrored Evan's own. He was handsome, bisexual, and reportedly addicted to cocaine and morphine. The friendship between Evan Morgan and Prince George was the axis upon which the social danger of Tredegar House turned. Here was the son of the King of England, a man whose face was on postage stamps, partying in a Welsh mansion where the laws of God and man were suspended. If the press had ever truly uncovered the extent of what happened during those weekends, The scandal could have toppled the monarchy long before the abdication crisis of 1936. Imagine the scene. The Duke of Kent, perhaps dressed in drag or merely in his shirt sleeves, playing the piano in the gilded room, while Evan Morgan, dressed in the silk robes of a mandarin or the vestments of a Renaissance cardinal, recited occult poetry to a room swirling with opium smoke. It was a dance on the edge of a volcano. They were two men who possessed everything the world could offer: wealth, titles, beauty, and yet were consumed by a boredom so profound it could only be cured by extreme sensation. The fuel for these gatherings was, of course, chemical. The wine cellars of Tredegar House were legendary, stocked with the finest vintages from France and Italy. Champagne flowed not by the bottle, but by the case. Servants, trained to be invisible, moved through the crowds with silver trays that never seemed to empty. But alcohol was merely the baseline, the social lubricant to get the conversation started. As the night deepened, the silver snuff boxes would appear. Cocaine was the drug of choice for the bright young things and the aristocracy of the era. It was clean, it was fast, and it provided the manic energy needed to keep the party going for 48 hours straight. It was consumed openly, tapped out onto polished mahogany tables, or sniffed from the back of hands adorned with family signet rings. For those seeking a different kind of experience, there were quieter rooms. Evan, with his fascination for the East and his connections to the occult underworld of London, was a connoisseur of opium. The sweet, cloying smell of the poppy would drift through the upper quarters. Here, guests could recline on velvet cushions, drifting into the hazes of a waking dream, while Evan acted as the guide, perhaps whispering suggestions or guiding their hallucinations with his hypnotic voice. He viewed these drugs not as vices, but as sacraments. In his twisted theology, intoxication was a way to break down the barriers of the ego. A drunk man, a stoned man, was a man who had forgotten to be afraid of society. He was raw material. Evan wanted to see what lay beneath the masks his guests wore. He wanted to see the animal inside the aristocrat, and the animal always came out. The sexual atmosphere of Tredegar House was thick enough to choke on. In the 1930s, homosexuality was a criminal offense in Britain. Men were routinely imprisoned, ruined, and driven to suicide for loving other men. But at Tredegar House, the laws of Westminster did not apply. It was a sanctuary for the love that dare not speak its name. Evan was openly, defiantly bisexual, though he likely would have rejected even that label as too limiting. He loved beauty regardless of gender. His parties were safe spaces for men to dance with men, for women to embrace women, and for everything in between. Cross-dressing was not just tolerated, it was encouraged. A trunk of costumes would be dragged into the center of the room: silks, furs, military uniforms, ball gowns, and guests would strip off their identity, along with their clothes, donning new personas for the night. It was a carnival of the senses, but it was also a trap. Evan was rarely just a participant in the debauchery. He was the observer. He possessed a voyeuristic streak that bordered on the predatory. He loved to watch. He would perch on a high-backed chair or stand on the balcony overlooking the great hall. Blue Boy, the parrot screeching on his shoulder, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk. He watched the breakdown of his guests. He watched the politician compromise himself with the gardener. He watched the actress weep into her gin. He collected these moments. They were proof of his power. He had created a world where he was the absolute moral authority, which is to say there was no authority at all. There are stories, difficult to verify but persistent, that the occult rituals were not kept separate from the parties. While the main crowd drank and danced downstairs, a select inner circle would be invited to the upper rooms or the cellars for something heavier. This is where the legend of the Black Mass comes in. The local rumors claimed Evan was sacrificing animals or worshiping the devil. The reality was likely more psychological, though no less disturbing. Evan was a devotee of Crowley's thelema, which focused on the will. The rituals he performed were designed to charge the atmosphere, to raise energy. He might lead a group of intoxicated guests in a mock religious procession, dressed in his papal chamberlain robes, chanting Latin verses backwards or reciting the hymn to Pan. To a devout Christian of the 1930s, this was blasphemy of the highest order. To Evan, it was a way of shocking the psyche, of forcing a spiritual crisis. He believed that by desecrating the sacred, you could release a tremendous amount of psychological energy. He was blasting open the doors of perception with dynamite. One particularly harrowing anecdote involves the Black Monk Room. It was said to be a bedroom painted entirely black, with a bed shaped like a coffin. Guests who displeased Evan, or perhaps those who pleased him too much, would be assigned this room. They would wake up in the pitch dark, disoriented, perhaps feeling the weight of something sitting on their chest, a sleep paralysis induced by the atmosphere, or perhaps a visitation from one of Evan's familiars. And always, there were the animals. The menagerie did not sleep when the party started. The baboon, honey bear, was a chaotic element introduced into the mix to ensure no one ever got too comfortable. Imagine the terror of a guest, high on cocaine and champagne, stumbling down a corridor at 3 a.m., only to be confronted by a fully grown baboon baring its teeth. Evan found the fear amusing. It kept people sharp. It kept the adrenaline pumping. There was a cruelty in Evan's humor. He once invited a group of strictly teetotal conservative church ladies for tea. He served them cakes that had been heavily laced with hashish. He then sat back and watched as the pillars of the community descended into giggling fits and paranoia, dismantling their dignity piece by piece. To him, it was a grand joke, a social experiment. To the women, it was likely a terrifying ordeal they couldn't explain. But the party that never ends is a terrifying thing. As the weekends wore on, the energy would shift from manic to desperate. Sunday mornings at Tredegar House were scenes of devastation. Bodies asleep on sofas, broken glass ground into the Persian rugs, the smell of stale smoke and spilled wine hanging heavy in the air. The bright young things looked less bright in the cold light of day. They looked haggard, ghostly. Evan, however, seemed to thrive on the exhaustion of others. He was an energy vampire. The more chaotic the weekend, the more vital he seemed to become. He fed on the transgression. He felt he was doing important work, keeping the flame of the Aeon of Horus alive in a gray, depressing world. Yet, outside the gates of Tredegar House, the real world was darkening. The 1930s were grinding toward their inevitable bloody conclusion. Hitler was rising in Germany. The Spanish Civil War was raging. The poverty in the Welsh valleys was deepening. The contrast between Evan's lifestyle and the reality of his tenants was becoming grotesque. The miners who worked the Morgan coal seams were risking their lives daily for a pittance, dying of black lung, while their lord spent thousands on rare orchids, cocaine, and occult manuscripts. Evan was not unaware of this, but he chose to ignore it. He retreated further into his fantasy. He believed he was above the petty concerns of economics and politics. He was a magus. He was dealing with cosmic forces, not labor unions. This hubris was dangerous. It isolated him. He was surrounded by hundreds of people every weekend, but he had almost no true friends. The sycophants loved his wine and his drugs, but they whispered about him behind his back. They called him mad. They called him dangerous. They ate his food and then laughed at his poetry. And there was another pressure building, one that even a magus couldn't magic away, the line of succession. Evan was the last male Morgan of the direct line. He had no brothers. He had no sons. The title, the house, the vast fortune, everything depended on him producing an heir. The weekend Saturnalia was all well and good, but a viscount had a duty. The spirits might be his passion, but biology was his obligation. His mother, the formidable Lady Aberconway, was constantly in his ear. She saw the waste of his life. She saw the danger he was in. She knew that if he didn't marry and settle down, the dynasty would collapse. She didn't care about his bisexuality, his magic, or his baboons, as long as he did his duty and produced a son. Evan resisted. Marriage was a trap. It was the ultimate bourgeois institution. How could a man who communed with the god Pan and slept with princes tie himself to a respectable woman and play house? It was anathema to everything he stood for, but the pressure was relentless. And perhaps in a dark corner of his mind, Evan began to feel the fear of mortality. He was approaching his late 30s. The party couldn't last forever. Even he could see the cracks in the mirror. He needed a partner, not just a broodmare, but someone who could match him, someone who could survive Tredegar House, someone who was as wild, as broken, and as beautiful as he was. He looked around the social scene of London, scanning the debutantes and the heiresses with a cynical eye. They were all too soft, too boring, too easily frightened. He needed a creature of fire. And then he found her. Her name was Lois Sturt. She was the daughter of Lord Allington, but she was no shrinking violet. She was a legend in her own right. She was an actress, a daredevil, a woman who flew planes and raced cars. She had been the lover of the Earl of Pembroke and had lived a life as scandalous as Evan's. She was beautiful, she was bisexual, and she was utterly fearless. She seemed perfect. She was the female equivalent of Evan Morgan. If anyone could understand the dark, twisted fairy tale of Tredegar House, it was Lois. Evan convinced himself that this was the solution. He would marry Lois. They would be the ultimate power couple of the age. They would turn the marriage into another piece of performance art. They would produce an heir to secure the fortune, and then they would continue their lives of magnificent excess together, ruling over their dark kingdom in Wales like a king and queen of the underworld. It was a seductive fantasy. It was the alchemical wedding, the union of opposites to create perfection. But Evan made a critical miscalculation. He assumed that because Lois was wild, she was invulnerable. He assumed that because she had seen the dark side of London society, she was ready for the specific, concentrated darkness of Evan Morgan's soul. He forgot that there is a difference between being a party girl and being the wife of a man who believes he is a sorcerer. He invited her into his world. He courted her with the same intensity he brought to his rituals. He showed her the glamour, the excitement, the power. He hid the sharpest edges. He didn't show her the emptiness at the center of the labyrinth. The engagement was announced. The society pages went wild. It was the wedding of the year. The two most notorious rebels of the aristocracy were joining forces. It looked like a triumph. But as the wedding day approached, the atmosphere at Tredegar House shifted. The spirits seemed restless. The baboon, Honey Bear, grew more aggressive. The servants whispered that the omens were bad. A storm was gathering over Newport, both meteorological and metaphorical. Evan stood on the precipice of his greatest experiment, attempting to blend his life of absolute magical freedom with the most rigid contract of social obligation. He was trying to bind a wild spirit into a domestic container. He had no idea that he was setting the stage for a disaster that would become the stuff of nightmares. He thought he was gaining a queen. In reality, he was preparing the ground for the night of the hunter, the wedding night that would become the most infamous legend in the history of the Morgan family. The guests began to depart. The champagne glasses were cleared away. The music faded. The stage was cleared for the next act. But this time, the genre wasn't a party. It was a gothic horror. In the glittering ballrooms of Mayfair and the smoky nightclubs of Soho, a rumor began to circulate that eclipsed all others. It was the kind of gossip that made dowager duchesses clutch their pearls and society columnists sharpen their pencils. Evan Morgan, the heir to the Tredegar fortune, the poet-magician, the man rumored to keep a baboon in his bedroom and a warlock in his cellar, was getting married. To the uninitiated, this seemed like a capitulation. Had the wild stallion finally been broken? Had the pressure of the dynasty finally crushed the rebellion out of him? But to those who knew Evan, and to those who knew the woman he had chosen, it was clear that this was no ordinary surrender to convention. This was a merger. This was a joining of two volatile chemical elements that promised either a brilliant new compound or a catastrophic explosion. The wedding took place in April 1928 at St. Margaret's, Westminster. It was the society event of the decade. The streets were lined with crowds desperate to catch a glimpse of the golden couple. The pews were packed with the cream of the aristocracy, foreign royals, and the artistic elite. As they stood at the altar, they looked like gods. Evan, tall and pale, radiating that strange ethereal charisma. Lois, dark and exquisite, trembling slightly, perhaps from nerves, perhaps from a premonition. The Archbishop of Wales officiated. The organ swelled. Vows were exchanged. To have and to hold from this day forward. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Here were two people who had spent their entire adult lives flouting the laws of the church, now standing in its center, promising to obey them. It was a magnificent piece of theater. But as the bells rang out and the confetti fell like snow, the curtain was coming down on the fantasy. The reality of Tredegar House was waiting. The reception was a blur of champagne and congratulations. But as the day turned to evening, the newlyweds climbed into Evan's Bentley and began the long drive west, away from the lights of London, towards the dark valleys of Wales. One can imagine the atmosphere in the car, the silence stretching out, the Welsh landscape growing wilder, the hills rising up to swallow the road. By the time they reached the gates of Tredegar House, night had fallen. The great iron gate swung open and the car crunched up the gravel drive, the headlights sweeping over the ancient oaks and the stone griffins that guarded the entrance. The house loomed in the darkness, a vast shadow against the stars. To Lois it must have looked romantic, a Gothic castle for her fairy tale. She didn't know that the house had teeth. They entered the great hall. The servants were lined up, bowing low. The air smelled of beeswax and that peculiar sweet incense that Evan insisted on burning. The baboon, Honey Bear, was likely kept away for the arrival, locked in some distant room, its screeches muffled by the stone walls. The wedding night. It is the moment where the public performance ends and the private reality begins. For most couples, it is a moment of intimacy. For Evan and Lois, it was the moment the trap sprung. We will never know the exact minute-by-minute choreography of that night. The Morgans were experts at bearing their secrets, but we know the outcome, and we have the fragments of terrified whispers that escaped the bedroom door. Lois retired to the bridal suite. It was a magnificent room, hung with tapestries. the bed a four-poster monster of carved oak. She prepared herself, perhaps waiting for her husband to come to her as a lover. She was a woman of the world, experienced and passionate. She expected a man. What walked through the door was not the man she had married at St. Margaret's. Evan entered. He may have been wearing his silk dressing gown, or perhaps he had already changed into something more ceremonial. He was not there to consummate a marriage in the traditional sense. He was there to initiate a rite. Some sources suggest that Evan, in his supreme arrogance and detachment from human norms, brought his familiars with him. Imagine the scene, Lois, waiting in the candlelight, looking up to see her husband enter with a large, loping creature at his side. Honey Bear. The baboon was Evan's shadow. He went where Evan went. To Evan, it was perfectly natural. To Lois, it was a violation of the most primal kind. To have a wild, aggressive beast brought into the nuptial chamber, a creature with staring eyes and bared teeth, was not just eccentric. It was a statement of dominance. It said, "You are not the most important thing in this room. My world, my madness, comes first." But the horror likely went deeper than just the animal. Biographers like William Cross have unearthed suggestions that Evan attempted to involve Lois in sex magic. He didn't want passion. He wanted power. He may have set up an altar in the room. He may have begun to chant, to invoke spirits, to treat the act of lovemaking as a mechanical process to generate magical energy. For Lois, the wild child of London, this was too much. She was a rebel, yes. She was sexually liberated, yes, but she was human. She wanted connection. What she saw in Evan's eyes that night was a total, terrifying absence of humanity. She saw that she was just a prop, a vessel, a component in a ritual. And she saw the danger. She saw that the man she had married was not merely artistic, he was dangerously unstable. The magus mask had slipped and she saw the void underneath. The story goes that she fled. She didn't just leave the room, she bolted. She ran from the bridal suite down the long shadowed corridors where the eyes of the portraits seemed to follow her, past the gilded room where the kangaroo boxed, past the cellars where the black altar stood. She ran as if the hounds of hell were snapping at her heels. She spent the night in another room barricaded in, or perhaps she even left the house entirely, driving into the night to escape the suffocating weight of Tredegar. The marriage ended that night. Oh, they stayed married on paper. Divorce was messy and scandalous, and neither of them wanted to admit to the world that the golden couple was a sham after less than 24 hours. They maintained the facade for the public. They would appear together at occasional events, smiling tightly for the cameras. But the union was dead. Lois never returned to Evan's bed. She retreated to London, throwing herself back into the party scene with a new, frantic desperation. She drank harder. She partied longer. The light in her eyes began to dim. She took lovers, seeking the warmth and humanity she had been denied at Tredegar. Evan, for his part, seemed unbothered. He had done his duty. He had acquired a wife. If she didn't want to participate in his great work, that was her loss. He retreated back to Tredegar House, back to his boys, his birds, and his baboons. The failure of the marriage didn't humble him, it hardened him. He became more reclusive, more obsessed with his occult studies. The tragedy of Lois Sturt is often overshadowed by the larger-than-life craziness of her husband, but it is the emotional core of the story. She was the collateral damage of Evan's ego. She spent the next 9 years slowly destroying herself. Her health, never robust, began to fail under the assault of alcohol and exhaustion. She died in 1937 in Budapest of a heart attack. She was only 37 years old. When news of her death reached Tredegar House, Evan's reaction was characteristically strange. He grieved in his own way. He wrote poems about her. He organized a memorial. But there was a sense that he was grieving a symbol, not a person. He had lost his queen, his alchemical partner. He hadn't lost a wife because he never really had one. Lois's death removed the last barrier. Evan was now a widower. He was free. But the pressure for an heir hadn't gone away. If anything, it was more intense. He was now in his mid-40s. The clock was ticking. The Morgan dynasty was hanging by a thread. And so inevitably, painfully, the cycle repeated itself. In 1939, as the storm clouds of the Second World War were gathering over Europe, Evan announced his second engagement. If the first marriage was a tragedy, the second was a farce. He chose Princess Olga Dolgoruki. She was a Russian exile, a woman of impeccable lineage and title. On paper, it was another brilliant match. A viscount and a princess. It sounded like the ending of a Disney movie. But the reality was even emptier than the first time. Evan was older now, more set in his ways, more deeply entrenched in his bizarre lifestyle. He made no effort to change for Olga. Why should he? He was the magus of Tredegar. Olga arrived at the house to find a place that was sliding into decay. The glamour of the 1920s was fading. The velvet curtains were dusty, the animals were mangy, and the master of the house was a man consumed by his own legend. The marriage to Olga was a disaster from day one. It lacked even the initial spark of attraction that had existed with Lois. It was a cold, transactional arrangement. Evan wanted a son, Olga wanted security. Neither got what they wanted. Evan made no attempt to hide his sexuality anymore. He paraded his male lovers in front of the princess. He continued his rituals. He treated her with a disdainful politeness that was worse than anger. Olga, unlike Lois, didn't try to destroy herself. She simply checked out. The marriage dissolved almost immediately. There was no dramatic wedding night flight this time, just a weary realization that the man she had married was incapable of loving anything that didn't crawl, fly, or exist on the astral plane. They separated quickly, leaving Evan once again alone in his great house. By the late 1930s, the atmosphere at Tredegar House had shifted from the Great Gatsby to Sunset Boulevard. The parties were fewer and farther between. The guests were less distinguished. The major celebrities, Huxley, Wells, Prince George, were moving on, sensing the shift in the wind. The world was getting serious. The threat of Nazi Germany was looming. The frivolous occult games of a Welsh lord began to look less like eccentric fun and more like a grotesque waste of resources. Evan began to look like a relic, a man out of time. He was still wearing the robes, still chanting the spells, still playing the feudal lord, but the audience was leaving the theater. He was isolated. The failure of 2 marriages was a public humiliation. It confirmed what everyone had whispered. The Morgan line was rotten. It was ending. The curse that the locals spoke of, the idea that the family had made a pact with dark forces and was now paying the price, seemed to be coming true. But Evan refused to change. If the world didn't understand him, the world was wrong. He dug in. He fortified Tredegar House against reality. He spent more time in the cellars. He commissioned more portraits of himself. He wrote more obscure poetry. He was preparing for the final act of his life, although he didn't know it yet. The war was coming, and the war would bring with it a new kind of horror, one that no amount of magic circles could protect him from. It would strip away his wealth, his servants, and his privacy. It would turn his beloved house into a military base. But before the soldiers arrived, there was a period of twilight, a time when Evan Morgan sat alone in the gilded room, the boxing kangaroo dead and stuffed, the baboon pacing in its cage, the ghost of Lois Sturt haunting the corridors, and the silence of a dying dynasty ringing in his ears. He was the king of a wasteland, and he was about to face his final reckoning. The onset of the Second World War in September 1939 did not just change the geopolitical map of Europe, it brought the curtain down on the surreal theater of Tredegar House with the violence of a guillotine. For 20 years, Evan Morgan had lived as if the laws of cause and effect did not apply to him. He had constructed a hermetically sealed universe of incense, poetry, and aristocratic privilege, a bubble where the only thing that mattered was the pursuit of sensation and the mastery of the arcane. But war is the great leveler. It does not care about your pedigree, your papal knighthoods, or your ability to summon elemental spirits. War demands utility, and for the first time in his life, Evan Morgan was about to discover just how useless a magician is when the sky is raining bombs. The transformation of the house was immediate and brutal. The blackout curtains went up, smothering the great windows that had once blazed with light during the weekend Saturnalia. The vibrant, chaotic flow of guests, the artists, the princes, the sailors, the hangers-on, evaporated overnight. The young men who had danced in his ballroom were now wearing khaki and marching towards Dunkirk. The women who had laughed at his table were driving ambulances or working in munitions factories. The bright young things were suddenly old or dead or terrified. Evan, however, initially viewed the war not as a tragedy, but as a new stage for his personal drama. He was a Morgan, after all. His ancestors had fought at Agincourt and Waterloo. He believed that martial valor was in his blood, encoded there, alongside the gout and the madness. He dusted off his military credentials. He had served in the Welsh Guards during the First World War, albeit largely in a ceremonial capacity due to his fragile health. Now he saw himself as a warrior poet, a mystic defender of the realm. He imagined himself as a modern-day King Arthur, rallying the spiritual and physical forces of Britain against the Teutonic darkness. He secured a commission. He was appointed to command a section of the Home Guard and later took on responsibilities with the carrier pigeon service, a role that seemed fitting for a man who loved birds, even if his previous avian companion had been a foul-mouthed macaw. He strutted around Newport in his uniform, the Sam Brown belt polished to a mirror shine, a revolver on his hip. He looked the part. He always looked the part. But the reality underneath the uniform was a man rapidly disintegrating. The war years were not kind to eccentrics. The tolerance that society had shown Evan in the 1920s, the indulgent smiles, the, "Oh, that's just Evan being Evan," vanished. In wartime, eccentricity looked suspiciously like treason, and Evan was a man who had spent the last decade cultivating close ties with questionable figures. He had hosted German diplomats at his parties. He had expressed admiration for the order of the fascist regimes in Italy, largely due to his Vatican connections. He was openly anti-Semitic in the casual, insidious way of the British upper class of that era. MI5, the British Internal Security Service, was not amused by Viscount Tredegar. They opened a file on him. They watched his movements. They intercepted his letters. To the intelligence officers sitting in drab offices in London, Evan wasn't a magus. He was a security risk. He was a man with a loose tongue, a drug habit, and a history of sexual blackmail ability. He was a liability waiting to explode. The explosion came, as it always did with Evan, in the most bizarre way possible. It wasn't a dramatic act of espionage. It wasn't a cloak and dagger meeting with a Nazi spy in a foggy alley. It was a court-martial for careless talk. Evan, in his arrogance, believed he was above the rules of operational security. He treated military secrets like gossip. He was overheard discussing the movements of troops, the locations of radar stations, and, most damningly, the details of the carrier pigeon network. He chatted about these things at dinner parties, in gentlemen's clubs, perhaps even to the young men he picked up in bars. He didn't do it out of malice. He did it because he couldn't conceive of a world where his words had consequences he couldn't charm his way out of. The military authorities did not care about his title. They arrested him. The Viscount Tredegar, the Lord of the Manor, the Papal Chamberlain, was court-martialed. It was a humiliation of seismic proportions. For a man whose entire self-image was built on the idea of superiority, of being one of the elect, to be treated like a common soldier who couldn't keep his mouth shut was a psychic wound that never healed. He was stripped of his command. He was effectively told to go home and stay out of the way. He retreated to Tredegar House, but the house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. The coal shortages meant the vast rooms were freezing. The damp began to creep into the tapestries. The gilding on the ceilings began to flake. The servants, significantly reduced in number, struggled to keep the dust at bay. The gardens, once the envy of Wales, grew wild and tangled. The boxing kangaroo was long dead. Honey Bear the baboon was gone, perhaps put down when food became scarce, or perhaps simply another casualty of the neglect that settled over the estate like a shroud. Evan wandered the freezing quarters, wrapping himself in his old fur coats, a ghost haunting his own life. But he wasn't just fighting boredom and cold. He was fighting a war on the astral plane. While the RAF fought the Luftwaffe in the skies, Evan believed he was fighting a magical war against the occultists of the Third Reich. It is known that the Nazis had their own obsession with the occult. Himmler's SS rituals, the Thule Society. Evan was convinced that Hitler was using black magic to sway the minds of the British people. He spent his nights in the cellars or the Black Monk Room, performing elaborate rituals of protection. He would light the black candles, draw the protective circles on the floor with chalk, and chant for hours, calling upon the archangels, Michael and Gabriel, to smash the forces of darkness. He claimed to be projecting a psychic shield over the southern coast of England. To the few servants left, hearing these low rhythmic chants echoing up through the floorboards, while the air raid sirens wailed in Newport, must have been terrifying. It was a cacophony of madness, the modern industrial war outside and the medieval sorcery inside. He wrote letters to the government, to the prime minister, to anyone who would listen, offering his magical services. He suggested that covens of witches be organized to curse the German high command. These letters were likely filed away in the do not reply pile. Further evidence for the authorities that Lord Tredegar had lost his mind. But the isolation was the real killer. The war had scattered his court, his sycophants were gone. And then in 1942 came the blow that shattered whatever remained of Evan's emotional stability. Prince George, the Duke of Kent, died. The Duke was killed when his RAF flying boat crashed into a hillside in Scotland. He was only 39. For Evan, this was not just the death of a friend. It was the death of his mirror image. George had been the only person who truly understood the duality of Evan's life, the burden of public duty, warring with the private hunger for forbidden pleasure. They had shared drugs, lovers, and secrets. They had been the two dark princes of the 1930s. When the news reached Tredegar House, Evan was inconsolable, but his grief, as always, took a twisted form. He didn't just mourn, He investigated. The crash of the Duke of Kent has always been surrounded by conspiracy theories. Was he flying to Sweden to negotiate a secret peace with Germany? Was he murdered by British intelligence because he was a liability? Was there a woman on board? Evan, with his paranoid mindset, believed it was an assassination. He became obsessed with the idea that the powers that be were eliminating anyone who didn't fit the mold. He felt the crosshairs on his own back. He held seances to try and contact George's spirit. He sat in the dark, calling out to the dead prince, desperate for one last conversation, one last reassurance that they weren't just spoiled children playing in the ruins of a dying empire. But the dead do not speak, or at least they do not speak clearly. The silence of the house deepened. As the war dragged on, Evan's physical health began to mirror the decay of his estate. He had always been hypochondriacal, but now the symptoms were real. He was losing weight. His voice, once a rich, hypnotic instrument capable of reciting poetry for hours, began to grow raspy and weak. He had developed a persistent cough. He blamed the damp, the stress, the lack of good wine. He didn't know, or perhaps he refused to acknowledge, that the cells in his throat were mutating, a rebellion of the flesh to match the rebellion of his soul. He was dying of throat cancer. It was a cruel irony for a man who had lived by the power of the word. His spells, his poetry, his seductions, everything relied on his voice. And now it was being taken from him. The pain led to an increase in his drug use. The cocaine of the party years was replaced by morphine, and whatever painkillers his doctors could be bribed or coerced into prescribing. He moved through the house in a haze, a gaunt figure in a silk dressing gown, his eyes burning with a feverish light. He began to resemble a character from a Gothic novel, a Roderick Usher watching his house fall apart. The magus was gone. Only the addict remained, yet even in this state the pressure of the dynasty did not relent. The question of the heir hung over him like the sword of Damocles. His 2 marriages had been failures. He had no son. He had no legitimate nephews. If he died, the Viscounty died. The title created for his grandfather, the culmination of centuries of Morgan ambition, would simply vanish. He looked at his relatives, the distant cousins, the respectable Morgans who had always looked down on him, and he despised them. He couldn't bear the thought of them inheriting his kingdom, but he was powerless to stop the biological clock. He had tried to breed a magical dynasty, and he had failed. He was a biological dead end. In a desperate bid for relevance, or perhaps just company, he turned Tredegar House into a sanctuary for a different kind of guest. With the military requisitioning so many large estates, Evan offered parts of the house for use, but always on his own terms. He allowed nuns to stay there, refugees from bombed-out convents. This was the final surreal juxtaposition of his life. In one wing of the house, Catholic nuns were praying the rosary, their black habits sweeping the floor. In the other wing, the dying Viscount was performing the rituals of Thelema, invoking the Egyptian god Horus. The sacred and the profane were living under the same roof, separated only by a few oak doors and a corridor of silence. Did he interact with them? Did he see the nuns as a chance for redemption? Unlikely. Evan Morgan did not believe in sin, so he did not believe in the need for redemption. He likely saw them as another aesthetic element, a live-action role-play of his own internal religious conflict. He enjoyed the irony. He enjoyed the thought that the house contained the full spectrum of spiritual experience, from the holiest to the most blasphemous. As 1944 turned to 1945, and the Allies pushed into Germany, the end of the war was in sight. But for Evan, there was no victory to celebrate. The world that emerged from the ashes of World War II was gray, socialist, and austere. The Labor government was swept to power. The age of the aristocrat was officially over. High taxes were introduced to pay for the war, taxes that targeted the landed gentry specifically. Tredegar House, a machine designed to consume money, was now a liability. The staff could not be paid. The roof could not be fixed. The great estate was bleeding to death. Evan watched the election results with a cynical detachment. He knew his time was up. He was a creature of the 1920s, a dinosaur who had somehow survived into the atomic age. The world of television, of the welfare state, of nuclear power, it had no place for a warlock viscount with a pet baboon. He spent his final years in a state of suspended animation. He still dressed for dinner, even if he was dining alone on meager rations. He still read his grimoires, but the energy was gone. The rituals became rote, a habit rather than a passion. He was going through the motions of magic, hoping that if he said the words often enough, the old power would return. But magic requires will, and Evan's will was broken. The scandal of the court-martial, the death of his friends, the failure of his marriages, and the physical agony of the cancer had hollowed him out. He began to settle his affairs. He looked at the vast collection of occult artifacts he had amassed, the wands, the chalices, the manuscripts. What would happen to them? He knew that after his death, his mother and his conservative relatives would burn them. They would try to scrub his stain from the family history. He likely destroyed many of his most private journals himself. He burned the letters from Crowley. He smashed the clay statues of the pagan gods. It was an act of self-erasure. If he couldn't be remembered as the great magus, he would not be remembered as a fool. He would leave behind a mystery. In the winter of 1948, the end was clearly approaching. He was bedridden. The great four-poster bed in the master suite, the same bed where Lois Sturt had fled in terror 20 years earlier, now became his entire world. The room smelled of sickness and medicine, masking the faint, lingering scent of frankincense. He was attended by nurses who were terrified of him. They had heard the stories. They whispered that he stared at corners of the room where nothing was there. They said he spoke in languages they didn't understand. They said the house groaned and settled around him, as if the stone itself was mourning its master. Evan Frederick Morgan, the second Viscount Tredegar, the adept of adepts, the friend of princes, and the summoner of demons, was dying, and he was dying exactly as he had feared, as a man, mortal and afraid, facing the great dark without a map. The war was over, the party was over, the guests had all gone home. The only thing left was the silence and the slow, steady beat of a heart that was tired of beating. The end, when it finally arrived, was not accompanied by a clap of thunder or a manifestation of the god pan. It came with the quiet, antiseptic rustle of a nurse's uniform and the shallow, rattling breath of a man whose body had simply given up the ghost. It was April 27th, 1949. Evan Frederick Morgan, the second Viscount Tredegar, was 56 years old. In the grand scheme of aristocratic longevity, he was barely middle-aged, yet his body was that of an old man ravaged by the throat cancer that had stolen his voice and the cumulative toxicity of 3 decades of excess. He died in a nursing home in Dorking, Surrey, far from the red brick walls of Tredegar House, far from the cellars where he had tried to rewrite the laws of the universe. There is a profound melancholy in the death of a magician. For all his claims of being an adept, of having a direct line to the secret chiefs of the astral plane, Evan died like any other mortal, in pain, likely frightened, and ultimately powerless. The great rituals, the invocations of Horus, the protective circles drawn in chalk, none of it could stop the metastasis of cells in his larynx. The biological reality crushed the magical fantasy. But if his death was quiet, the aftermath was a landslide. The immediate consequence of his passing was the extinction of the Viscounty. The title, which had been created for his father as a reward for political loyalty and vast wealth, vanished the moment Evan's heart stopped beating. He had no son. He had no heir. The curse of the Morgans, whispered about by the superstitious locals in Newport for generations, had seemingly fulfilled its final clause. The direct line was broken. The barony passed to his elderly uncle Frederick, a man in his 80s who had no interest in the occult or the grand crumbling estate, and who would himself die a few years later, leaving the family tree withered and barren. The funeral was a strange affair. It was held with all the pomp befitting a lord of the realm, yet there was an undercurrent of awkwardness, a collective holding of breath. The mourners were a mixture of the respectable and the bizarre. Relatives who had spent years apologizing for Evan's behavior stood shoulder to shoulder with the few remaining Bohemian friends who had survived the war. They buried him in the family vault at Basileig Church, laying him to rest alongside the ancestors who would have undoubtedly been horrified by the life he led. With the body in the ground, the real dismantling of Evan's world began, and the architect of this destruction was none other than his own mother, Catherine, the Dowager Viscountess. Catherine was a formidable woman, eccentric in her own right, but hers was a sharp, controlling eccentricity, not the wild, drug-fueled chaos of her son. She had watched Evan turn their ancestral home into a circus. She had watched him squander the family fortune on warlocks, boys, and baboons. She had watched him shame the family name with court-martials and scandals. Now, she was left with the mess. She looked at Tredegar House, that massive pile of restoration brick that had dominated the landscape for nearly 3 centuries, and she felt no sentimental attachment. She saw a money pit. She saw a house stained by memories she wanted to forget. She saw the room where Lois Sturt had fled on her wedding night. She saw the cellars where Aleister Crowley had chanted. She saw the decay. In 1951, just 2 years after Evan's death, she did the unthinkable. She put Tredegar House up for sale. This was the death knell of the landed gentry in South Wales. For 500 years, the Morgans had been the kings of the county. They owned the land, the coal, the docks, and the souls of the people who worked them. Selling the house was an admission of defeat. It was an admission that the modern world had won. But who buys a massive haunted mansion in post-war socialist Britain? Who wants a house with 40 bedrooms, a history of black magic, and a heating bill that could bankrupt a small nation? The aristocracy was broke. The industrialists were being taxed into oblivion. The buyer, when they appeared, provided the final supreme irony of Evan Morgan's life. The Sisters of St. Joseph of Annecy. The Catholic Church bought Tredegar House. The nuns, the brides of Christ. You could not write a better ending to a Gothic novel. The house that had been the headquarters of the Black Mass, the house where gender was fluid and morality was optional, was purchased by a convent to be turned into a girls' boarding school. The nuns moved in with efficiency and holy water. They began the process of spiritual fumigation. They walked the corridors where Evan had once paraded in his robes, their rosary beads clicking softly, a new rhythm to replace the frantic jazz and the occult chants. They turned the gilded room where the kangaroo had boxed into a chapel. They turned the bedrooms where the Bright young things had collapsed in cocaine-fueled heaps into dormitories for innocent schoolgirls. It was an exorcism by occupation. The nuns scrubbed the floors. They opened the windows to let in the light. They painted over the dark, brooding colors Evan had favored. They removed the last traces of the menagerie, the cages, the perches, the lingering smell of wild animals. But a house like Tredegar does not forget easily. The nuns, for all their piety, were not immune to the atmosphere of the place. Almost immediately, stories began to circulate among the sisters and the students. They spoke of cold spots that no amount of heating could fix. They spoke of the sensation of being watched from the shadows. They spoke of a presence in the cellars that was so oppressive that some of the sisters refused to go down there alone, even to fetch supplies. There were rumors that when the nuns first moved in, they found remnants of Evan's practices that had been missed by the auctioneers, strange symbols carved into the woodwork in the basement, candle wax that had dripped into the cracks of the flagstones and couldn't be scraped away, a peculiar, sweet smell of incense that would manifest suddenly in the middle of the night and then vanish. The students, too, whispered about the wicked Lord Tredegar. He became a boogeyman, a cautionary tale. If you didn't say your prayers, the ghost of Evan Morgan might come for you. They claimed to see a figure walking the grounds at twilight, a tall, gaunt man in a long coat, sometimes accompanied by a large bird. For 23 years, the nuns held the line. They educated a generation of girls within those walls, imposing order on the chaos. They were the custodians of the transition, the bridge between the feudal past and the public future. But by 1974, the cost of maintaining the sheer fabric of the building became too much even for the church. The roof was leaking, the brickwork was crumbling, the beast was starving. When Tredegar House finally opened to the public as a museum, curators initially tried to hide Evan's dark chapter, but the house itself would not let him be forgotten. Today it is one of the most haunted properties in Britain. Staff report oppressive chills in the king's room and visitors in the cellars. The sight of the old magic room often feel physically ill, hearing low rhythmic chanting from behind the walls. But the most terrifying report comes from a night security guard who shone his torch down a dark corridor, only to see a large gray baboon sitting on its haunches, staring back at him before vanishing. The circus, it seems, has never left. Evan failed to build a dynasty, but he achieved a twisted kind of immortality. In 2013, a strange discovery proved that the Magus remained defiant to the end. Archivists found a collection of poems written in his final dying months. Scribbled in the margin of the last page in a hand suddenly strong and aggressive was a single symbol, the unicursal hexagram, the mark of the beast, the signature of Aleister Crowley. Even facing the void, Evan Morgan signed his name to the universe one last time. The party's over, but somewhere in the cold stone silence of Tredegar, the host is still watching.